Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Kadiatu Kanneh-Mason.
Hi there, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm great. So can you tell me about your book?
So I've written a book, House of Music, and it's about bringing up my 7 children who are all classically trained musicians. And I suppose when I started writing the book, it was going to be about the journey from their childhood into becoming successful musicians. And then I realised I had to go much further back than that. I had to go into my childhood, my husband's childhood, and the story of where all this came from. So it's very much a story of immigration as well. It's a story of the history of our family. So it's about so many more things than I thought it was going to be about.
Yes, and I love this book so much. I know I just said this to you before it started, but for anyone listening to this, please go read this book. It's really just so beautiful. And some of my favorite parts was in that where you're talking about like your childhood and like growing up and having this like sort of thing where like you immigrated and like trying to grow up in Europe and like learning like all about like this new culture and like having the two different things. It was just so beautiful. And I also really loved when you were talking about your connection to the music. So can you tell me a little bit more about that? And like for our audience to hear more about like how you were connected to that growing up.
Yes, it's interesting because lots of people asked me before I wrote the book, why is it that you've introduced your children, we're a black family, to classical music? Because it's not something that's very usual. And I thought back about my childhood. And in fact, my father, I was born in Sierra Leone in West Africa. My father's Mende, my mother's Welsh. But actually, it was on both sides of the family where there was this general love of music, but also this real appreciation of classical music. So I learned music as a child. I played the piano and the clarinet. I was in orchestras, but that love of music was on all sides of my family. So it's not something I think which belongs to one culture and not another. And I think that's not a new thing. That's always been the case.
Yes, I love that because so much of the time, like in the music industry and in any parts of that, it can feel so reserved just for very wealthy white people. And I am white, but I am not very wealthy. And it's like, it's hard to see like, oh, well, you've got to be able to afford lessons and you have to be able to be let into those lessons and have all of these, there's so many barriers. And it was so incredible hearing about like you and your children and your husband, like all this working to break down a lot of that.
Yes, and I think the barriers, because I think the problem with people thinking classical music is elitist is actually because it is expensive and because it's not there in state education. It's not made affordable and available to people. So it becomes elitist. But I think then people tend to think it's elitist because that's what it is. But of course, there's no reason for it to be. And I think what we wanted to do is show that it doesn't matter who you are, the music should be there for you and to give people the courage to go and play and listen and to just open it all up.
Yes. I kind of want to talk a little bit more about something that you were saying about your kids in the book and like how you said, like, you didn't really have a choice but to like give them this musical education. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, it started with my eldest, and I felt that she was someone who really needed music in her life. We introduced her to the piano, and we thought it would be something that she would enjoy, but she absolutely loved it in a very, I think, complete way. And she went so far and so fast, and she was obviously very talented. And when we introduced it to the others, it was the same thing. And we felt that when you have children like that who clearly need to play music, then it becomes a real responsibility, and you have to give them the opportunities as a parent, which is not easy. But we didn't think we had a choice in that at all.
Yeah. I have a lot of friends who are gifted, and I've got one especially that's like crazy gifted in music, and like it's the same thing with that, where it's like the parents are like, okay, we didn't really have a choice. I'm homeschooled. And my parents said the same thing about that. It was like, we needed to have you homeschooled because there wasn't an option. And I just thought that was really interesting hearing that from another perspective and like kind of having that validated almost, like hearing other people saying that same sentiment.
Exactly. And I think it's not so much that parents decide what they're going to do before they have children. I think the children very much decide what
Mhm.
will happen. And parents just have to do it.
Yes, yes. Um, so can you tell me a little bit about how you got to the place where you knew that you wanted to write this?
Well, it wasn't really a choice of mine. I remember that after concerts where my children played, people would come up to me and say, "So, what's the story behind this? And why don't you write a book?" And I used to find it quite funny. And the children kept coming up to me and saying, "Well, come on, Mum, why don't you do it? Why don't you write this book?" And so I started writing, and I found it really difficult because
Mhm.
it's such an emotional thing to do, and you have to go very deep and examine lots of things. And so I stopped writing, and it was them who kept pushing me to do it. They said, "Mum, you've got to finish it." And so that's why I did. It really came from them.
I love that. That's really cool because I was wondering while reading it because it's very personal and there's a lot like you tell a lot about your life and like struggles that you've had and like it doesn't just skim the surface. And I've read a lot of memoirs that just it's like I was born and I was immediately brilliant. And then I had seven children and they were all immediately brilliant. And there was nothing else that happened in my entire life. But this didn't do that. Like you really talked about like how like the struggles with like raising them and growing up and all of that. And I think that that's really like amazing that you put that out there.
Yes, because I didn't want people to think I was just some kind of super mum or we were super parents and we had these amazing gifted children and that's how it happened. Because I think it's really important to show how what that responsibility is and what day to day that means in order to raise children like that and in order to have the courage and how much it costs and what the difficulties are because that was the truth. And when I started writing it, I remember I was just sitting writing and tears were pouring down my face. It was very, very hard. But
Yeah.
it was important because otherwise there was no point skimming the surface.
Mhm. Yeah. You got to go all in and you really did. Um, so what made you want to tell it in this way that was like spanning like multi generations, like talking about like your parents and all of this, like, and not just focusing on one aspect of your story?
Because I found that when I started writing and I was talking about how we brought up the children and what our ethos was and what our ethics are and what we believed in, I thought none of this is making sense because you have to know what the background of that is and
Mhm.
what built us and what made us the family we are. And I think no family is just on its own as a kind of nuclear project. It's something that comes from so many generations of ideas and struggles and love and history. And if you don't talk about that, then it just doesn't make sense. And I think it's very much formed what our idea of the future is and what we want for the children as well.
Yes, definitely. I really I love that, and I love that you give that background too. Like you were saying like you're not just a super mom. It didn't just automatically appear in this like final form of like the way that it is. But I love that you went back. So were there any parts of the book that were especially hard to write and like hard to get
I think the hardest part was talking about my own childhood and talking about that experience of coming to Britain for the first time as an immigrant in the
through?
1970s. And I think that was hard because it made me think about my own children and my own children's lives. Because when I had children, we actually went abroad for about 3 years. And I remember thinking, I don't want to come back to Britain because I don't want them to go through the same things that I and my husband went through. And I think it's very difficult for parents because you have to always be aware that your children are living in a different historical present. You can't put your own past on top of them, but at the same time, you want them to learn from what you've gone through. So it's a very difficult balancing act. And I think that's why it was difficult to talk about two different childhoods at the same time, really.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And things have shifted so much just in the world since then. And like, but I totally get it. Like I live in Chicago, and there are parts that it's like before it was like a really like preppy, beautiful neighborhood, or there are areas where it was like rougher, and now it's like completely different. My parents every now and again will be like, wait, what happened here? Because gentrification, that's an issue for another day, but there's stuff like that where it's like, oh, this used to be something that we didn't feel comfortable letting a kid go to, or a place that we wanted you to go to, and then it completely shifted.
Yes. And I think parents have to learn from their children and they have to listen to them. And I think it's a constant conversation. And also, I think the world changes, but of course, some things don't change and then some
Yeah,
things come back. And I think you always have to be alert to that. So I think if you talk to young people all the time, their reality is really important to stay in contact with, I think.
definitely. I was saying something to one of my friends recently, and we were talking, and I was like, oh, well, I was giving some excuse for something, and I was like, oh, well, they're from a different generation. And she was like, well, no, they've been here. They're still here. They lived through our generation too.
Nice.
And
Yes, exactly.
yeah, what you were just saying, it made me think of that. Like you're still here and you can still learn. And like, if you're still aware, you can.
Yes, a lot of people say to me, "Oh, it's wonderful. You brought your children up, you taught them," and I say, "Well, no, actually, they teach me as well. It's a very circular thing, and that's very important, I think. And that's what as I wrote the book, I thought, oh, that's so true. I have grown a lot through bringing them up, so it's not just from the top down."
Yeah, definitely. So why did you decide to highlight the final of like the BBC Young Musician thing in the opening chapter of the book?
I think because for us, that was the moment when everything changed. I mean, a lot of people, when they look at the family, say, oh no, it was the moment when Sheku played at the royal wedding for Harry and Meghan. And I think that was when globally everything changed for the family. But for us, that BBC Young Musician, if you grow up in Britain, it's the most important event for young people in classical music, and it's very, very famous. And we grew up watching it all the time. And so for our own child to win it, it was momentous. And of course, no black people had ever won that competition before. So it was something that meant a lot to all of us. It meant a lot to black people in the country. It meant a lot within classical music. And that was what suddenly we got lots of attention.
That's amazing. And I loved the way you described it too, because it just felt so so very personal, and it's something that's not like, because it's like broadcast on live TV. Like it's like a big thing that global, like that people can see, but it felt so vivid. Like it felt like I was there, and I've personally never seen anything for that because I'm in the US and not in classical music, but just the way that you said it felt so like I was right there. I loved that. And I felt that way through a lot of the book too. And I kind of want to ask you about that, because a lot of times in memoirs and autobiographies, people will go back and just be like, well, I was here and I did this and I then did this. But you really took time to describe like, oh, well, this person walked in and said this, and it did this to me internally. Like it felt almost like I was reading a fiction book in parts of it. And I loved that. I loved that. How did you decide to format it that way though? And
I think it was partly because it wasn't a story just of the past. We are very much still living it. So it was because I still have children, and we are still I'm still going through bringing them up. And so I was writing about something which is also very present. And I think I was mixing the present and the past and writing from within something, which is an incredibly emotional thing to do. But it meant I had to write it like a very living thing and a very present thing, because it's still very living and very present. So I think that's probably what dictated that.
I loved it. And especially like when you were going farther back into your past and like talking about like meeting your husband. I loved that part when he had proposed to you when you were 20, and then you just were like, no, of course not. I loved that. and it made me laugh right then, because I was like, it's awesome. And it just, I don't know what to say, but otherwise it felt very real, but it's a real story. So um
And in fact, that was my children's favourite bit as well, because I think children love the story of their parents meeting. And
oh
it's not
yeah.
something we talk about all the time, so they were fascinated.
Yes. Yes. As a child, I can say that I always love telling people like, oh, well, my parents met like this and this happened. And yeah. Um, so can you tell me a little bit about the process of writing about your own life? And like, did you have to contact people to like fill in blanks? Did you have to like, what happened with that?
I think the most profound thing that I learned is when you are talking about your own life, especially as a child, memories of a child, you impose your own narrative upon it and you have your own memories. And so I had all these different timelines and ideas. And then I spoke to my mother and she said, oh, no, it didn't quite happen in that order. Oh, but no, you were 3 then, not 5, and things like that. And
Mm,
so I learned a lot just by talking to her. And I spoke to my sister and my siblings, and it was really interesting. I thought, oh, that was your perspective. So I think always when you are telling a story, there are so many different ways of telling it. And
mm.
your reality is very, very real. But I think when you have conversations about it, and I think that was the same when I was writing about my children's lives, because when I first started writing the book, I thought, yes, we knew everything that was going on. And then all these stories kept coming back and no, you didn't know everything, Mum.
Yes. I love that too. And it really felt like you got a lot of different perspectives, like there was a lot going on, but I also think that's hilarious. And it's like, no, 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 we weren't doing that. Um, yeah. So do you think that you are going to write more in the future, publish more books or more about your family?
I think I will. Partly because a lot of people have asked me about that, and my children keep saying, "Well, that's something that I should do." But it was really funny. As soon as I'd finished writing the book, I thought, "Yes, I'm going to carry on writing." And then what happened? We had a global pandemic, and then everyone home, and life changed. So it was a bit like going back in the past when I suddenly had all my children at home. I was cooking and washing and cleaning, and I suddenly had no time again. So now
Mhm.
that hopefully things are getting back to some kind of normal, I will start writing again.
Awesome. And you really are a brilliant writer. I will be on the lookout for the next book. But I feel you on the pandemic, because I feel like so much of the stuff is people have been saying like, oh, it's the perfect time. Everyone can write and get all of this stuff done and do, but no,
No.
because there's new responsibilities that come with that.
Yes, I found it exactly the opposite. And I found that the anxiety of it, because of course all my children suddenly, their careers had stopped. There were no concerts, there was no traveling. We didn't know what the future was. So I think when you've suddenly got this uncertainty about the future and anxiety, it's very difficult to create.
Yeah.
So I didn't find that I was doing all these wonderful things that I heard people were doing, making jam and sourdough bread and learning a new hobby. I wasn't doing that.
Yeah. And I can't even imagine having 7 kids in the house. I'm 14 and I was like, oh God, this has been so hard and like trying to create in this. And yeah. Um, so do you have a favorite point in the book or a favorite part that you like when you were writing that you were just like, oh my goodness, this was so much fun to write?
Oh gosh, that's a really interesting question because actually I found writing, um, I didn't find it fun. I found it just incredibly painful most of the time. Um, I had to work very, very hard, just making sure that I wrote it as it was. And I wanted to be absolutely truthful. I didn't want to miss anything out. And that's actually, I found it was more a huge responsibility because I was talking about so many more lives, not just my own. And
Mhm.
so it wasn't for me, it wasn't fun. But it wasn't work either. It was a bit like, and it wasn't therapy because I
Mm.
didn't feel at the end, oh, that's it, I'm fine now. I felt I was just digging deeper and deeper and deeper. But it was a huge learning process. But I
Oh,
enjoyed, yes, I thought what I enjoyed was the interaction I had with my children about the book because they told me so many funny stories. And yes, and I just found that very funny.
mhm. That's awesome. Yeah. But I feel you on it. Was it like, I might be misunderstanding what you're saying, but it was more cathartic,
Yeah,
right?
I don't know if cathartic is the right word because I think it was something where I had to confront a lot of demons and I
Mhm.
had to go back into pasts that I didn't really want to go back into, but I thought that it was very important. So I think it was strengthening without
Okay.
being a relief. Yes, I can't say that it was a relief.
Okay. I love that. Strengthening. That's
Yeah.
that, that's a really great way to describe that. Do you have any other like any other words that you would use to describe the book or the writing process even?
Um, well, I think for me, the writing process was about making connections. So I found it's not really a book about classical music. Yes, it is about classical music because that's what we do, but it could be about it just parenting and children who have gifts or any children. It's about creativity. They could be children who are doing sport. It would be very similar stories. And I think there is a way in which, when you're talking about creativity, you can be talking about sport, art, writing, music, and I think it's important that all children have access to something creative. And I found what I was talking about all the time was love and families and very universal things, but from the very particular point of my family. So
Mm.
it didn't feel that it was a book about classical music at all. In a way, it was about that, but that was just one aspect.
Yeah, I definitely felt something like, I mean, that's what the book is because it's about family, but like even going back into your childhood and stuff, like I felt connected to all of those members of your family and the way that you described it. And like it was so loving. The way that you described everything. And like the people in the book, the key players, like your kid, your husbands, your siblings, like all of these people, it was like, oh my goodness, I've never met them, but I feel so connected to them.
Yes, and I think what it did, it made me feel it was about connections, but it was also I was quite humbled, I think, because I thought actually your children are always so much bigger than you think they are. They've got so many possible futures. They're going to grow away from you. They're always going to be part of you, but you can't own or know everything about them. And I think children are amazing things, and you have children you think, oh, I'm going to kind of bring them up and I'm going to put my stamp on them, but actually they are so much more than that, and I think that was very humbling.
Yeah, it's so cool. And that really definitely came across. And I love the one part when you're talking about like why you had seven children and you say in it, you're like, I don't, it was just like necessary. Like that was how it was. I loved how you described that.
Yes, because I don't think you can give a rational explanation for having even one child, because it's not about that. It's not a logical thing to do. It's just something which is just innate and emotional. Yes, it's about love. Exactly.
Mhm. And that really definitely came across that was like what it was. And throughout the entire book, not even just in that section, like I felt that from the first chapter when you were talking about the young musician, the BBC one. It was so clear how much care was put into these for these people. Can you tell me a little bit about like I don't know how to word this exactly, but like trying to write a book for the first time and having it be about yourself. Because a lot of the time people have the first book, even if it's nonfiction, about like, oh, it's a fiction thing, or it's, oh, this is about nonfiction, but it's about this other aspect. But like having it be about yourself and your family.
Yes, I mean it's exactly. It's in a way it was absolutely necessary for me to write it because I thought there is so much there that I want to say, that I want to communicate. And I think because the children were being talked about quite a lot in the media, I wanted to say this is how it is from our perspective. And I think in a way we were sort of being exposed to the world, but I wanted to say this is what we mean, who we are. But it's not easy because you have to reveal so much that people don't see or
Mhm.
don't know about. So it's a bit like taking your clothes off in public, where you think, well, okay, this is it, this is the whole story, and it's not all easy. So yes.
Yeah. I love how honest it was too. And I can only imagine how difficult that must have been to like put it all out there, like taking your clothes off in public. Like, yeah, like you're putting it all out there.
Yeah.
And yeah.
But it's interesting that you say it's because, yes, it's a book about myself and my family, but I think it goes back to connections. I thought it's not actually just about us. It's about people like us. It's about what it's like to be black in this country. It's about what it's like to bring children up to do something very intensively, to succeed, what failure is like. I thought it was about
Mhm.
all those universal things as well. And I thought it was about saying things that are not said or that are not central to what people say. So I didn't think it was just so much about myself as an individual, it was about something bigger. So I think that's why it was possible to do.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right. And I think that I used the wrong wording on that one because as I was reading it, I felt a connection to this book. And like as I was going through it, it was, yeah, it's like what you're saying. It wasn't just, oh, I feel a connection because I'm reading a book about you. It was like, no, I feel a connection to this story because I know people that have had this stuff like this happen. I have had stuff like certain things in the book happen. Like it's more talking about like the process of being raised gifted and like having all of these different things. So that was my mistake on that one. You're absolutely correct. And I don't think I would have felt that connection with a book that was just about like just about a singular person.
Which is wonderful to hear that because that's what I was hoping for. So it's wonderful that you felt that.
Yeah. All right. Well, you know what? That was actually about all I had for today, but thank you so much for coming on. This was so great to talk with you.
Thank you. And I can't believe you're 14. That's
Oh,
amazing.
thank you.
Your parents must be really proud of you. It's extraordinary.
Oh, thank you. That's so sweet. So I just have one last question, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Oh my goodness. Well, this weekend we have what are called the BBC Proms at the Royal Albert Hall in Britain, and it's the biggest international festival of classical music that we have here in the UK, and it's
Mm,
all on the television and everything. So that's what we've got this weekend. My daughter had a prom on Tuesday. Then the whole family, all seven of them, are playing on Sunday. So we are preparing for that at the moment, which is a huge thing. So
that's
we're all
amazing.
yeah.
Oh my goodness. Wow. I'm gonna see if my TV lets me watch that. That's so cool. Well, everybody tune in for that. Please buy this book and read it and just like let it wash over you because it's so amazing. Once again, thank you for Read Between the Lines. My name is Molly Southgate.
And my name is Kadiatu Kanneh-Mason.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. This episode is hosted by Molly Southgate. It is edited by Rob Southgate and produced by Southgate Media Group. You can get in touch with the show at readbetweenthelines@gmail.com, or you can send us a voicemail at 708-887-9473. That was 708-887-9473. You can also find us on Instagram at Read Between the Lines Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.